Government Business. Order of the Day number 9. National Broadband Network Companies Amendment, Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024. Resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to speak on the National Broadband Network Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024. The National Broadband Network was first dreamt up as a policy by former Labor Senator Stephen Conroy in the lead-up to the 2007 election. It was an ill-thought-through, careless and lazy piece of policy. I was so frustrated by it that I wrote a book, Wired Brown Land, about the broadband battles in Australia. The book came out in 2009. I'm often asked how did it sell. Well, for a book about telecommunication economics, extremely well. My central point was that the policy that then Senator Conroy devised dismally failed because it sought to get Telstra to do something that it did not want to do, namely build a national fibre to the node network for $4.7 billion and give its competitors access to that network. An even more ill-conceived policy was then dreamt up by Stephen Conroy and Kevin Rudd. Notoriously, the details were sketched out on the back of a beer coaster on a flight on a government jet. And under that policy, the commitment was to spend what was supposed to be $43 billion on a fibre to the premises network. If you go back and look at what was promised in the 2009 media release and press conference by Kevin Rudd, Stephen Conroy, Wayne Swan and Lindsay Tanner, just about every aspect of what they promised has been a manifest failure. As a result of this policy, some $30 billion of taxpayers' money has been spent, and the value for money taxpayers have received has been absolutely appalling, in stark contrast to the frugal Kiwis who managed to get a national fibre network for a total taxpayers' commitment of $1.5 billion New Zealand dollars. In the nearly 15 years I've been in the parliament, and having taken quite an interest in this issue, I've spoken many times on stupid pieces of legislation associated with Labor's national broadband network. Yet the bill before the parliament today achieves an unenviable distinction. It is the most stupid, pointless, empty, nakedly political, entirely useless piece of cynical, performative gesture politics that Labor has managed to serve up in its nearly 2 decades of deeply undistinguished policy-making on the national broadband network. In the time available to me, I'd like to make 3 points. 1. Labor's record on the NBN is hopeless. 2. The policy framework on future ownership of the NBN was established by the Rudd government under Stephen Conroy as minister, and indeed it was his then representative in the House, the now Prime Minister, who explained what that policy framework would be. The bill before the House today, which proposes to change that policy framework, which for some 15 years Labor has thought was absolutely fine, is a naked, meaningless, cynical and empty political stunt, and the Coalition will be voting against it. Let me start with the proposition that Labor's record on the NBN is hopeless. As I've already indicated, the plan they announced in 2007 completely failed because Telstra's then management team refused to cooperate. So they announced another plan in 2009. Kevin Rudd promised that his government would build a national broadband network. It would serve 90% of homes with access speeds of up to 100 megabits per second, take 8 years to complete and cost $43 billion. None of this was achieved. Let's judge what Labor delivered by the time it left office in 2013 against what had been promised in NBN's 2012 corporate plan. Labor promised 286,000 premises passed by June 2013. NBN Co fell a full 100,000 premises, or almost 40% short of its target. And of the premises it claimed, many were designated as so-called Service Class 0 or Service Class 1, meaning they could not actually provide a service at all. Labor was systematically dishonest about what the NBN was delivering, and the man who was Communications Minister at the time was Australia's current Prime Minister, the man who just loves being upgraded to seat 1A. Let me remind you what happened in August 2013 during the election campaign. The then Minister for Communications, the member for Grayndler, stood in front of a big red button and announced that broadband was now available to 5,400 homes and businesses in Sydney's western suburbs. It's fantastic to see the NBN fibre network is now available, he said. What he didn't say was that close to 1,000 of these were service class 0, and 98.6% of these homes had no fibre connection to the home. By the time of the 2013 federal election, NBN Co said it had passed 209,000 premises, but close to 80% of these had no fibre going into the home. It was not fibre to the premises, it was fibre to the press release. When the Coalition took over responsibility for the NBN, we set about fixing the problem in a methodical way. Our 2013 strategic review recommended using a combination of rollout technologies, the multi-technology mix. Had we continued with Labor's model, it would have taken up to 5 years longer to complete the rollout and cost billions of dollars more. If we'd stuck to Labor's plan, when the pandemic hit and millions of Australians moved overnight to working and studying from home, Australia would have been in a dreadful mess. But thanks to the Coalition's work, the NBN was ready for the challenge, with 98% of premises around the country, over 11 million, able to connect in early 2020. I've said it before and I'm very pleased to say it again. As the Communications Minister at the time that the pandemic hit Australia, I am enormously proud of the efforts made across Australia's telecommunications sector. NBN, Optus, Telstra, TPG, Vodafone, you can go on, Aussie Broadband, a whole range of other companies came together to keep the network operating when Australians desperately needed it, and that was critical to the way that our nation was able to get through the pandemic. Let me turn now to Labor's policy framework on NBN ownership. This is the framework developed by Labor and legislated in 2011. It carefully sets out the steps that in its judgment, in the judgment of the Labor Party, would need to happen before the NBN could be sold by the government to private owners. Let me quote from the Minister's second reading speech in this place on the National Broadband Network Companies Act 2011. Quotes, "The first bill in the package, the NBN Companies Bill, obligates NBN Co to limit its operations to and focus them on wholesale-only telecommunications. It also sets out arrangements for the eventual sale of the Commonwealth's stake in the company once the NBN rollout is complete, including provisions for independent and parliamentary reviews prior to any privatisation, and for the Parliament to have the final say on the sale. The bill also creates a power for the Governor-General to make regulations concerning future private ownership and control of NBN Co and establishes other relevant reporting, governance and enforcement mechanisms. As such, the bill deals with arrangements for both today and into the future." I remind the House, these are not my words, I'm quoting from the words of the then Minister, the member for Grayndler, now the Prime Minister. He went on to say, "Taking into account the recommendations of the implementation study on the NBN, the Commonwealth will retain full ownership of NBN Co Limited until the rollout of the NBN is complete." He then went on to say, "After the Communications Minister has declared that the rollout is complete, the Productivity Minister may direct the Productivity Commission to undertake a 12-month inquiry into a number of matters. These may include the regulatory framework for the NBN and the impacts of a sale of NBN Co on the Commonwealth budget, consumer outcomes and competition. Within 15 sitting days of the Productivity Commission inquiry report being tabled, a Parliamentary Joint Committee on the ownership of NBN Co Limited is to be established according to the practice of Parliament to examine the report of the Productivity Commission inquiry. The Joint Committee will report to both Houses of Parliament within 180 days of its appointment. After it reports, the Finance Minister may, by disallowable instrument, advise that conditions are suitable for an NBN Co Limited sale scheme." As is clear from this extensively quoted material, the Minister of the day laid out a clear framework which needed to apply before the National Broadband Network could be sold. He did not say the NBN could never be sold. Instead, he set out a comprehensive series of steps which would need to occur before the Parliament was given the opportunity to consider an instrument prepared by the Finance Minister advising that conditions are suitable for an NBN sales scheme. Of course, what this means is that under the existing legislation, unless both houses of Parliament agree, no sale can occur. The Minister, who explained this development, these required stages to the House so carefully and thoroughly in his second reading speech, is, of course, as I have informed the House, the member for Grayndler, the current Prime Minister, enthusiastic recipient of air travel upgrades, keen real estate investor, the member for Grayndler. Let us be clear. There is a comprehensive framework in the legislation developed and passed by the Australian Labor Party, setting out all the things that would have to happen before the NBN could be sold. Critically, one of those steps involves the tabling of a disallowable instrument. That is, an instrument which can be disallowed by a majority vote of parliamentarians in either house. No privatisation could occur unless there was majority support for it in the Parliament. That has been the policy setting since 2011, the policy settings devised and implemented by the Australian Labor Party. Given the realities I have just explained, any reasonable observer would ask, what is the possible point of the bill which is before the House now? Given that privatisation of NBN could not occur unless a majority in both Houses of Parliament agreed to it, what possible additional work does the bill before the House do today? The answer is clear. It does no substantive or real work at all. That is why I say this bill is the most stupid, pointless, empty, nakedly political, entirely useless piece of cynical performative gesture politics that Labor has managed to serve up in its nearly 2 decades of deeply undistinguished policy making on the NBN. That is why the Coalition will be voting against it. This is not the first time the current Prime Minister and his Communications Minister have tried on this particular stunt. Similarly, in the lead-up to the 2022 election, they tried to bring on a big political fight about whether there was some difference between the parties about the future of the NBN. On 17 November 2021, this dynamic duo issued a media release containing this ringing commitment: Labor will also keep the NBN in public hands. This attracted virtually no attention then, and it's not attracting much attention now. This is a non-issue. The existing legislative framework, introduced in a rich irony by the current Prime Minister in 2011, sets out very clearly what has to happen before the National Broadband Network could ever pass out of public ownership. It cannot happen unless there is majority support for it in both Houses of Parliament. Deputy Speaker, if the member for Grayndler and the member for Greenway had any capacity for shame left, if they had any self-knowledge at all, they would be curled up on the floor in writhing agonies of embarrassment at having brought forward this ludicrous bill. I say for the third time, this bill is the most stupid, pointless, empty, nakedly political, entirely useless piece of cynical, performative gesture politics that Labor has managed to serve up in its nearly 2 decades of deeply undistinguished policy making on the NBN. I say to anybody who is listening tonight, you should be very cross that the Prime Minister and the Minister have wasted the time of the National Parliament on this ludicrous joke of a bill. I am very pleased to say the Coalition will be having nothing to do with this useless bill.
I call the Honourable Minister in continuation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I seek leave to continue my earlier speech.
So I call the Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It is Labor governments that build. It is Labor governments that decided to make the decision.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted. Yeah.
Leave is granted.
Yes, please proceed.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It is Labor governments that build. It was a Labor government that made the decision to build the national broadband network. And then we saw time and time again the Liberal Party and the National Party try and block it. And we know that when it comes to the builders versus the blockers, time and time again, we heard just then from the manager of opposition business, the ironic manager of opposition business giving ourselves a lecture on stupid and pointless. And I think there was nothing more stupid and pointless than choosing copper over fibre, which was the stupid and pointless decision that the Liberal Party made back in 2013. And again, that's why I have no trust when it comes to how those opposite will seek to ruin, wreck, damage and destroy the national broadband network for the future. And it is essential that we legislate to keep it in public hands. The Australian people have invested in the national broadband network. The Australian people rely on the national broadband network every day for education, for their jobs, to enjoy the great joys of living in Australia. And we know the privatisation record of those opposite. I know it was the WA Liberals who wanted to privatise Western Power, sending power prices up through the roof for Western Australian households. I opposed that, and the Western Australian people backed us on that. We know that we had the Liberal National Party sell Medibank private. They sold it out. And then we also had the grand plan to privatise the Medicare payments threshold. And they got to the idea of privatising the Medicare payments threshold because the now Leader of the Opposition couldn't get his plan through for a GP tax. So he got so angry, so aggressive, that he decided instead he'd go and try and privatise the Medicare payments. And that is why it is essential that we keep the national broadband network in public hands where it belongs. This bill will make sure that this critical infrastructure, which reaches some 12.4 million premises in Australia, stays in public hands. It is too important to put into the hands of a private operator or to sell off to fill some Liberal National Party debt black hole in the future. What we know is that currently 8.6 million homes and businesses across Australia are connected to the national broadband network, and they connect because of the security provided by a public provider. And we owe it to them to give them that security for the future. And this legislation will make a difference. It will remove the legislative conditions, the legislative framework to enable the privatisation of NBN Co. And I do say that it's time to stop that option being on the table, because we've been through such a journey in this country, such a journey. We saw back in June 18, 2007, dragged kicking and screaming, we saw the Howard government, of which the now Leader of the Opposition was a minister, finally come to a plan where they were going to give $900 million to Elders and Optus to develop an internet network for the regions. After so long of doing nothing, they finally said they would do something. They were also promised that they would deliver, quote, a state-of-the-art broadband network with coverage for rural and regional areas. Again, what we saw was experts come out, a number of them, and blast that $1.9 billion package. And again and again, we saw the then Howard government, of which the now Leader of the Opposition was a key member, trying to play catch-up. Because it was. In 2007, it was Labor who said, we finally need national action for this technology of the future to connect Australians, to connect families, to connect people to one another through this incredible technology, which is now, again, relied on by some 8.6 million households and businesses across this country. And I do take the interjections from those opposite, where they come in here and tell us how much they wish broadband services could have improved. And if only they'd been in government for almost a decade, and if only they'd taken that opportunity, rather than trying to trash the NBN, which is what they spent all their time doing, going for these outdated technologies of copper, which didn't work when it rained, copper that didn't work when there was electrical interference, copper that at best would give you 25 megabits a second, because they couldn't bring themselves to ever admit that fibre was better. They couldn't bring themselves to admit that. And when those opposite last came into government were developing their policies, this was the dominant view of the Liberal and National parties. We had then opposition leader opposition leader Abbott tell former opposition leader Turnbull he wanted him to, quote, demolish the government's national broadband network. That was their stated policy goal, was to demolish the national broadband network. And then we had the then former leader of the opposition, who eventually became the future Prime Minister Turnbull, say that declaring the NBN would be the absolute focus of this, with that goal to destroy it. And just to remind the Australian people how much the Liberal Party and the National Party struggled to understand the importance of broadband. What we saw was the then opposition leader Abbott describe it as, quote, essentially a video entertainment system. Now, I dare anyone opposite to go and say that in their electorates today. It is so much more. It is essential for small business. And I stand up for my small businesses, and I know they need the NBN. If you want to sell it off, you want to sell it out, you want to stick them with copper, then by all means do it. We then had the tech geniuses tell us, in the then leader of the opposition, quote, we are absolutely confident that 25 megs is going to be enough, more than enough for the average household. Well, tell that to practically anyone in Australia today. We then had the networking explained to us by the then leader of the opposition, quote, saying, all those people who are sending messages from their iPhones and Blackberries, all those people sitting in airport lounges using their computers, I mean, they don't rely on fixed line services. Well, Deputy Speaker, I'd hope that in the 10 years since, those officers have learned that actually Wi-Fi eventually does connect to the fixed line service, and the fixed line service and the backhaul network, of which the National Broadband Network is an essential part, does matter. They said they wanted to, and then again, those opposite went out saying they just wanted to axe the National Broadband Network, get it out of the way.
Order.
What we had was their leader of the opposition come out and say, quote, the National Broadband Network is a luxury Australia cannot now afford. But we know that was completely the wrong call. We couldn't afford the delays, inaction and copper obsession of the Liberal and National Party. And then they promised probably the biggest lie of all, which was, quote, I want our NBN rolled out within 3 years, and Malcolm Turnbull is the right person to make this happen. Not only did it not roll out in 3 years, Deputy Speaker, Malcolm Turnbull was definitely not the right person to make it happen. But now we are finally making progress again on getting fibre and fast broadband to the people and small businesses of Australia. And what we've got now is we reached the milestone earlier this month, something that we can all celebrate, which is that we got to 9 million Australian homes and businesses now able to make the switch to ultra-fast NBN. And that means that 90% of people on the fixed-line NBN network can get access of up to 1 gigabit per second. 1 gigabit of data per second by the end of 2025. Compare that to the measly 25 megabits a second that was being offered by the Liberal Party and the National Party. A significant improvement. And if I think about what that means for some 82,000 households and businesses in my electorate, it means that now they can take the access of the benefits of fibre broadband. And I know, because it was the story of my household even, Deputy Speaker, that we were on the Coalition's old copper network, so unreliable that we couldn't use that network, now thankfully on the fibre network. And I know that benefits families in Ashfield, Bassendean, Bayswater, Bedford, Coolbinia, Dianella, East Perth, all getting access to fibre NBN. But it doesn't stop there. Eden Hill, Embleton, Highgate, Inglewood, Jundana, all getting access to fibre NBN, something they were denied by those opposite. Leederville, Maylands, Menora, Morley, Mount Hawthorn, Mount Lawley, North Perth, Northbridge, Osborne Park and Perth, all getting access to fibre NBN. Chewett Hill, West Perth and Yokine. And again, it means that families not only get the benefits of fast broadband, but they also get the benefits of saving, on estimates from the National Broadband Network itself, saving users more than 100 hours and $2,580 in travel costs a year. What we know now is the average home has some 22 connected devices on average. And that, again, means that the 25 megabits a second unreliable copper that those opposite tried to sell for so long does not do the job. And if I think about what that really means for families, is it means that we've got students, we're not just trying to act by cutting their HECS debt or giving them access to fee-free TAFE. We're trying to give them the tools of learning for the 21st century, giving them ultra-fast broadband. When it comes to supporting small businesses and people who are starting new businesses, again, the tool and access to start that new business is ultra-fast broadband, whether it be at your business or your home. When it comes to people who might be looking to be able to spend more time with family and friends, we've got the great benefits of being able to be connected through video conferencing that don't require as much travel. Again, reducing, as I just said, saving up to 100 hours, reducing people's carbon footprint too. It makes a huge difference. And again, what I know from my constituents is that they want broadband. And indeed, what I'm hearing from some of those opposite is that people in their electorates want ultra-fast broadband too. And I would hope that those members opposite go back to their electorates and say, did you know that the reason it's taken so long is because the Liberal Party and the National Party made a mistake? We made a mistake by backing the wrong technology. They made a mistake by backing the wrong technology, by choosing the technology of copper rather than the technology that was always going to be right, which was fibre. They make this mistake a lot of times, Deputy Speaker. They look to the technologies of the past rather than the technologies of the future. They look to copper rather than fibre. They look to nuclear rather than renewables. They're always looking for the technologies of the past rather than the opportunities of the future. And what we want to make sure is that as we get more investment,
This is getting ridiculous. You need to deal with it. She's got a problem. If she can't stop talking, she should leave the chamber.
Order.
Thank you.
And I don't know why some of those opposite are so exercised about trying to keep an essential public service in public hands. I don't know what it is that they dislike about public services.
They love
privatisation. They tried to privatise the work that was being done in Centrelink. They tried to privatise Western Power in my great state of Western Australia. Deputy Speaker, I note that my power bills and your power bills and my constituents and your constituents have cheaper power bills because that privatisation of Western Power did not go ahead. And again, I think there are real benefits in keeping the national broadband network in public hands, where it belongs. It is absolutely essential infrastructure. I don't want to see it sold off to some overseas conglomerate. I don't want to see it sold off into the private market where they care more about profit than making sure that every Australian gets the quality service of broadband that is now essential for people's learning, essential for their work, essential for their social connection, and more often now, Deputy Speaker, essential for their safety as well. We know that many medical devices now can be very effectively enhanced by access to fast broadband, giving people more insights into their health and their health needs. When it comes to keeping the national broadband network in public hands, I think most Australians will say, yeah, that's right. We saw the sell-off of Telstra and how that held Australia back when it came to making sure that we had the technologies of the future. We took the brave decision, and I want to commend what the member for Kennedy said, that former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd will be remembered as visionary for backing this technology, for backing this initiative to make sure that Australians do have access to ultra-fast broadband. We're cleaning up a decade of confusion, delay and copper wires strung across the country. We're putting the fibre in, we're getting it done and we're keeping it in public hands.
I thank the Minister and I give the call to the member for Flinders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have seen some weird things in this place in my short time here, but this desperate move by the Albanese government is right up there, taking a podium place in the super weird and unnecessary category of legislation coming before the Australian Parliament this term. Last sitting period, the government, literally apropos of nothing, ran into the chamber at 9:01 on the 9th of October to present this bill, the National Broadband Network Companies Amendment, Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024. There followed the strangest of second reading speeches, first from the Minister for Communications and then from the Prime Minister himself, with a hitherto unrecognised passion for telecommunications policy in which he lauded the NBN and its importance to the Australian community like he'd just discovered the internet. There followed a question time in which almost every question from the government to itself went to the ownership of the NBN and the desperate, urgent need to safeguard the future of the NBN. What? Where on earth did this come from? Has there been a raging debate about the public or private nature of the NBN? No. Is the NBN about to go broke and needs a public bailout? No. Is there a secret plan on either side to sell the NBN? No. Is there a problem of any sort to solve with the NBN being in public or private ownership? No, there is not. I can tell you what the problem is that this Albanese Labor government is trying to solve for. A truly terrible political freefall situation in which the Prime Minister finds himself as we head into an election year. It has been a truly terrible few weeks for the Prime Minister. In fact, a terrible few months. In fact, a truly terrible end to 2024, and let's be honest, an entirely terrible term of Parliament. In his second reading speech on this bill, the Prime Minister talked about all the things the NBN is able to do to help this country get ahead and achieve. And I agree. Having served on the board of the NBN from July 2018 until I resigned to seek pre-selection to stand in the 2022 federal election. And I agree with the Prime Minister wholeheartedly. The NBN has greatly facilitated banking, health and education, but for the coalition government changing to a multi-technology mix back in 2013, the NBN would never have been finalised in time to get this country through the COVID-19 pandemic. The PM didn't mention the difference the NBN has made to entertainment and all the high-quality streaming into our homes and the exceptional Australian content we are now able to see on our handheld screens, except that's not what it did. As an aside, you see, I note the irony that on the morning that the Prime Minister rushed in here to present this supposedly urgent legislation, I was meeting with Screen Producers Australia. Representatives of Hoodlum Entertainment, Archipelago Productions, the Film, Television and Radio School, Fremantle Australia, Ludo Studio, Media Stockade, Newtown Films, the National Institute of Dramatic Arts and Roadshow, great Australians who have contributed over decades to our best Australian content, like Bluey, Neighbours, Wentworth, Heartbreak High, Grand Designs. Oh, I love that show. Red Dog, Happy Feet, Muriel's Wedding, Mao's Last Dance at the Castle. They explained to me the crisis confronting their industry because 2 years ago they were promised a local content quota for the streaming corporations, which was going to take effect on 1 July 2024. And so here we are, 2 years later since that promise was made, and the sector has heard precisely nothing from the Albanese government, no action, no support for our local screen industry, and frankly, no sign of support between now and the next election. But yet somehow, saving the NBN is the most vital thing to the Australian economy. It can be pulled from the blue, urgent, and drafted overnight. The NBN must be saved. Why, you may ask? The Minister and Prime Minister have been keen to tell us this legislation will ensure NBN prices are more affordable for consumers. What? I'm sorry, you just couldn't make this stuff up. NBN prices since this government was elected have gone up. Back in October 23, NBN announced significant changes to its pricing. Lighter use packages got cheaper, prices for NBN 25 and 100 got cheaper, excellent, but prices for the much more popular NBN 50 package went up. So now some 6 million Australian households are paying up to 14% more for their NBN packages with one of the retailers. So did these changes result from careful pricing, planning and direction from the Albanese government? No. It happened because the NBN finally settled its special access undertaking with the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Earlier this year, on the 1st of May, the NBN said in a press release, like many other businesses in Australia and worldwide, NBN has been impacted by high input costs of materials from suppliers. The wholesale prices that NBN charges to retailers in financial year 25 will increase by approximately 4.1% on average across NBN's range of wholesale services. This reflects the annual percentage change in the Consumer Price Index over the 12 months to the December 23 quarter. The NBN's prices roadmap is influenced by the CPI. And we all know this government's record on the CPI. Under this government, monthly CPI reached a peak at over 8% in December 22, and almost 2 years later we are finally seeing an inflation rate with a 2 in front of it, consistent with the Reserve Bank of Australia's inflation target of 2 to 3%, but core inflation, the figure that matters most on which the RBA makes its decisions regarding interest rates, remains at 3.5%, higher than all of our major trading partners, higher than the US, the UK and Canada, and the IMF predicts it will remain at 3.6% in 2025, higher than its forecast for Germany at 2.1%, the UK at 2%, Canada and the USA at 1.9%, and France, Italy and Japan at 1.8%. The rest of the world is already seeing interest rate relief, but not here, and therefore it should be no surprise that a record number of small businesses are failing. On the same morning as the Prime Minister and Minister for Communications rushed in here with their urgent bill, The Australian had an article which read as follows: company insolvencies have hit record highs, with more than 6,600 firms faltering in the 6 months to September, fueling warnings small businesses are struggling to stay afloat amid high inflation and interest rates, increasingly complex regulations and cyber attacks. Australian insolvency statistics published by ASIC reveal company insolvencies capturing firms entering external administration for the first time hit 11,053 in 23-24, swelling overall insolvencies since the 2022 election to 22,800. Well, I've got some good news for those 22,800 companies that have gone broke since this Albanese government was elected. The NBN is going to stay in public hands. I'm sorry to break the news, but the NBN is in public hands, and it has been since the legislation was passed to create the NBN in 2011. And this government has done nothing, literally nothing, to bring NBN prices down, either between 2011 and 2013 when they lost power, or since their return to the Treasury benches in 2022. Nor, newsflash, could it, lest it want to risk being found to be a shadow director of the NBN board. If anyone sitting today is wondering, why is the Albanese government doing this? Is it something clearly thought through, carefully planned? Did they have a long-term goal to remove the otherwise even longer-term possibility of maybe one day privatising the NBN, the process for which is set out in the Labor government's own Act of 2011 in Part 3, Division 2, called Ownership and Control of the NBN Co. That part provides for the NBN to be privatised if and when A, the Communications Minister has declared the NBN is built and fully operational. B, the Productivity Minister, and by the way, this government doesn't have one, which is just as well given it's the weakest productivity level in 6 decades. The Productivity Minister has caused to be tabled in both Houses of Parliament a report of an inquiry of the Productivity Commission. C, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on the Ownership of the NBN Co, newsflash, that doesn't exist either, has examined the Productivity Commission's report, and D, the Finance Minister has declared conditions are suitable for the entering into and carrying out of an NBN Co sale scheme. Again, newsflash for the Albanese government. While condition A has been completed, none of B, C or D is either underway or even in contemplation by either side of government. There was no imminence to a sale. This is pure posturing and mightily convenient financial posturing, if I may say so myself. You see, 3 months ago, the NBN repaid the last tranche of public loan to the Commonwealth on the 30th of June 2024. In its financial report of 13th of August of this year, the NBN announced the company refinanced the remaining balance of $5.5 billion relating to the $19.5 billion Commonwealth Government loan in full by 30 June 2024. NBN Co's capital strategy remains focused on funding network investments and maintaining a strong liquidity position. So riddle me this. The Albanese government lets the company fully repay that loan to the Commonwealth, which it did by seeking more advantageous loan terms on the private market at the time, and in doing so the Albanese government boosts its budget coffers, reinforcing its ever so persistent liberal light, we're so responsible with the budget rhetoric, and then Money in the Bank declares the NBN will always be in public ownership. Thanks, NBN, for repaying the debt, but if you don't mind, we'll just keep the title deeds. What an absurd, indulgent, look an eagle tactic from this lot. I knew these guys were in trouble politically, but this desperate move shows you just how deep that trouble is. At 8:59 a.m. on the 9th of October, when the minister ran in to introduce this bill, no one was talking about privatisation of the NBN. It has been a long-standing option, an eventual plan, one for which the NBN had been carefully, diligently and responsibly managed to keep that option open, ensuring it was run efficiently and effectively with the best of private sector know-how on its leadership and board ranks to ensure the best use of this public investment in a dynamic and constantly changing telecommunications market. This was a Labor Party plan, and in 2010 the then Minister for Broadband, Communications and the Digital Economy, Senator Stephen Conroy, issued a press release which said, Senator Conroy said the Gillard government remained firmly committed to selling its stake in NBN Co after the network was fully built and operation, subject to market conditions and security considerations. Labor then put the sale provisions into the 2011 Act. And when the Labor Party dreamt up the NBN back in the 2000s, it was a one-size-fits-all fibre to the node to each and every Australian home, no matter the distance, no matter the need and no matter the use case. And when the Abbott government was elected in 2013, the NBN was a shambles with less than 50,000 homes connected to the grid. Today, the NBN, thanks to coalition policy, provides a plethora of internet solutions to the best places where they are suited. The multi-technology mix sees Australian homes and businesses served by fibre to the home or premises, fibre to the building, HFC, fibre to the curb, fibre to the node, fixed wireless and Sky Muster satellite and shortly LEO satellites. As a result of coalition government policy, the NBN is largely complete, providing fast internet across this enormous nation, a territory larger than the USA and larger than the EU in landmass. Labor's record in the NBN is truly appalling and needs some exploration here. You might remember the original plan from that side of politics was rolled gold fibre to every single home, paid for by you, the Australian taxpayer. And when the Abbott government was elected, there was barely 50,000 homes connected to this Rolls-Royce version of the NBN. Labor's plan was indulgent, expensive and illusory. When a full review was undertaken after Labor lost the 2013 election, it was found their decadent plan was going to cost the Australian taxpayer $73 billion back in 2013 figures. The coalition government's review of the planned rollout was summed up beautifully by an AFR editorial in 2013. Who would have thought? It turns out that a massive government-run telecommunications monopoly that was built from scratch and which aims to push other competitors out of the market is very expensive. As things stand, the grand monument dreamt up by the Rudd government's telecommunications minister, Stephen Conroy, will leave Australia with close to the highest broadband prices in the developed world. That was the model we inherited. And by the time the Albanese government was elected in May 22, the build had been finished for 2 years and more than 8 million Australian homes were connected to the NBN. And on the 9th of October, the Prime Minister came into this chamber, breaking with all common practice, to give a speech about this bill. And in it he said, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam once said that his definition of equality was every child in Australia having a quiet room to study in and a desk with the lamp to read. But that was the 1970s, and in 2020, for every Australian child, it needs to be at their desk with access to the NBN. Gough Whitlam turned this country into an economic basket case. It seems the Prime Minister is determined to do the same.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This is a really important bill which reaffirms this government's commitment to the public ownership of what is one of Australia's most critical infrastructure assets, the NBN. And I just don't know where to begin with some of what I've heard from those opposite while I've been sitting here waiting to speak. But the member for Flinders has just said that there's something wrong with the Prime Minister saying that in this day and age every Australian child should have a place to study with access to the NBN. I mean, I think that is an excellent thing for us to aspire to. But what we've heard from those opposite is they just don't get vision. They don't get nation building. They don't want people to have things that they don't pay for if they can't afford them. That's what this is really about. The idea that every Australian would have had access to fibre to the premises broadband as was originally proposed by the absolutely visionary plan under the Rudd government that was the NBN, that those opposite absolutely trashed of 10 years in government, among other things that they've trashed. They just don't get it. No, they're not vision people. They don't want to see Australia leading the world. The part of the point of the NBN when it was initially proposed was the ubiquitous nature of fast broadband. The fact that it was ubiquitous, that everyone was to have access to it, that everyone would have this very fast broadband, would revolutionise the way we've delivered services. The access to things like education and healthcare for people in, regional areas and remote areas that they always claim to be representing. But anyway, here we are. So this bill is an important bill that makes explicitly clear that keeping the NBN preserved in public ownership is an explicit requirement. It removes the current conditions for terminating government ownership by repealing most of Part 3 of the NBN Act. Because Labor is the party of the NBN. As I said, it was a visionary idea under the Rudd government. It was established and began the rollout with the goal of a fully connected Australia. The original vision for a fibre-to-the-premises connected Australia was trashed by those opposite when they came to government, and it's been left to the Albanese Labor government to clean up their mess, as it has been with so many policy areas. But make no mistake, those opposite would jump at the first opportunity to sell this important asset if given the chance. And I think the speeches, just those I've heard in the short time I've been here, make that very clear, that they don't understand the NBN and they would take the first opportunity to trash it. Just like they did with Telstra, just like they did with Medibank, and just like they did with the Australian Public Service, the Coalition is addicted to privatisation and outsourcing, with the Australian public always paying the price. What we're doing today is ensuring the NBN's future. Commitment to public ownership is vital for the NBN to deliver the services Australians rightly expect. Now let's look back on the history of the NBN under those opposite. The Liberal Party's handling of the NBN stands as a stark reminder of how critical it is to approach significant national infrastructure with vision and with commitment to the public interest. Vision and commitment to the public interest. I know that's difficult for those opposite. Under the negligence of the Coalition, the initial vision for a world-class fibre-based NBN was undermined. Instead, they opted for a multi-technology mix that left Australia lagging behind our global peers in both speed and reliability. This was an approach that resulted in increased costs, blown-out timeframes and outcomes that fell well short of what Australians were promised and what we deserved. Despite claiming that their strategy would save money and accelerate the rollout, the reality was an NBN fraught with issues, delays, unexpected costs and widespread dissatisfaction among users. The Liberal Party's poor decision-making left the network under-resourced and underperforming, impacting businesses and households alike. What should have been an enabler for economic growth and digital participation became a source of frustration for millions of Australians. Their governance also demonstrated a willingness to privatisation over public benefit, and this is what they always do. In 2020, they declared the network built and fully operational, a move that set the stage for its eventual sale. They even supported NBN Co's push to raise wholesale prices by CPI plus 3%, a policy that would have hit Australians hard, undermining affordability in favour of profit-driven motives. It took the intervention of Labor and the ACCC to protect consumers from these proposed price hikes. The Coalition's legacy is marked by missed opportunities and the weakening of what could have been an unparalleled national asset. That is what's so sad about this, the inability of the Coalition to embrace vision for Australia to lead the world, which is what we were trying to do with the NBN, and for all Australians to share in that, for everyone, to have the chance to have the fastest possible broadband that would revolutionise the way we did things. But instead they prioritised short-term gains and ideological commitments over long-term strategic investment. And the Liberal Party left Australia playing catch-up on connectivity and digital capability. Our government is committed to reversing this legacy and ensuring that such missteps are not repeated. We stand by the principle that the NBN must remain in public hands, fostering upgrades, innovation and affordability for all. It's not just about restoring what was compromised. It's about moving towards a vision for a more connected, just and secure future for Australia. This stance is driven by the need for continuous upgrades to the network, regulatory oversight of wholesale pricing, and most importantly, the delivery of affordable broadband for all Australians. We're delivering on the NBN's promise of equity and access to the digital economy. In 2022, the Albanese Labor government underscored this commitment through the updated Statement of Expectations for NBN Co. Our directive was clear. Public ownership is the cornerstone that will enable us to extend more fibre throughout the fixed line network, lay the groundwork for transitioning to next-generation satellite technology and modernise our universal service obligations. These steps are essential for a more connected and inclusive Australia, one that leaves no community behind, whether they be in the heart of our cities or the vast expanses of our rural and regional areas. And improvements to the network are ongoing. Just last week, I was pleased to hear that further upgrades will begin shortly in my electorate of Canberra, and this is something that Canberrans have been speaking to me about. When we were in opposition in the last term, people were disgusted with the access that they had to the NBN and how far it fell short of what was promised. And so I'm proud that we are fixing that, including here in my electorate. The fibre upgrade program has been bolstered by the government's $2.4 billion commitment over 4 years to provide an additional 1.5 million fibre-to-the-node premises with access to full fibre. As a result, 90% of premises in the NBN fixed line footprint can place an order for gigabit-capable services by the end of next year. In our recent announcement, 37 ACT suburbs have been announced for inclusion in the fibre upgrade program. These include Ainslie, Braddon, Bruce, Cook, Dixon, Garran, Griffith, Hawker, Kaleen, Lynham, Macquarie, Narrabundah, Reid, Turner and Yarralumla, here in my electorate of Canberra, providing faster speeds for Canberrans as part of the publicly owned national broadband network. And, I think a lot of people in this place don't understand that, Canberra is a real community with real needs as well, and I know that, a lot of those opposite, they love to trash on Canberra, because public servants live here and they hate them too. But, it's really good that we're actually getting improved access to the NBN, because we don't have it either, because what their government did to the NBN over 10 years of neglect and trying to destroy it affected us here in the nation's capital as well. So I am pleased that we are addressing that and that those suburbs are getting what they should have got a long time ago, thanks to the Albanese Labor government, because the NBN is a Labor legacy that is worth protecting. Deputy Speaker, it is crucial to remember that the NBN isn't just an infrastructure project. It's a strategic asset intertwined with our national security and cyber security needs. Ongoing government ownership ensures that the NBN's operations align with national interests, protecting Australia from the significant risks that foreign ownership could pose. To sell off the NBN would be to jeopardise this oversight and expose Australia to serious sovereignty and security concerns. In this bill before the House, we reaffirm that the NBN is not just a commodity to be sold. It's a vital public service that underpins our economy, social fabric and national security. The reaction to this bill by those opposite is very telling, and it demonstrates yet again their ideological obsession with privatisation. And I'll remind the House again, because it bears repeating, the former coalition government, under the member for Bradfield, initiated measures in 2020 to prepare the NBN for sale, declaring it built and fully operational. And having been here for the member for Bradfield's contribution to this debate just a few speakers before, it is obvious that these are people that would destroy the NBN if they ever were back into government. They have a complete disdain for it because, as I said, it was a visionary, nation-building project. It was about universal access for all Australians, and these are things that don't sit comfortably with their ideology. Their readiness for privatisation included supporting a proposal from NBN Co to raise wholesale prices by CPI plus 3%, a move aimed at boosting revenue streams before a sale. This would have had significant repercussions for consumers, especially in terms of affordability. Labor, alongside the ACCC, firmly rejected this proposal to safeguard Australians from unnecessary price hikes. That would have been a disaster. We need only look at history to see the consequence of privatising public telecommunications infrastructure. The Howard government's sale of Telstra serves as a cautionary tale. Promises were made about maintaining service quality and affordable prices, but those promises were never met. On top of that, the sale left the government without the leverage to spearhead the rollout of fibre broadband, necessitating the Rudd government's launch of the NBN project. Deputy Speaker, this bill did not appear out of thin air. Our ongoing consultations with communities across rural and regional Australia have sent a clear and consistent message. People want the NBN to remain under government ownership. They recognise that only with public oversight can the network continue to deliver modern, accessible and affordable communication services. Keeping the NBN in public hands is not just a strategic decision, it is a commitment to the prosperity and connectivity for every Australian. It is about ensuring that the digital divide narrows and that no one is left in the dark, disconnected from the opportunities that the modern world offers. Because yes, to the member for Flinders, we do believe that, in an updated version of Gough Whitlam's vision that every child should have a place to study with a lamp on, we do believe that every Australian student should have the NBN, should have access to reliable, fast broadband, because if they don't have it, how will they ever keep up with their peers? How will they ever have the same opportunities if they don't have access to these things? And how will we ever deliver those things if we don't keep it in public hands? If it's not about building our nation, about a strategic asset to benefit all Australians that we regularly update and improve. The Albanese Labor government will always stand firm when it comes to public ownership of the NBN. We will continue to safeguard the NBN from those who would seek to sell it off. The NBN is an essential tool for Australia's economic resilience, social equity and national security. Labor will not repeat the Liberal mistakes of the past when it comes to privatisation. Instead, we will build on the promise of a connected, secure and inclusive future for all, because that is what Labor governments do. When we come into government, we bring vision. We bring the hopes of Australians who rely on governments to ensure that they have the best chance, that every Australian has a chance at a happy, healthy, fulfilled life. Public education, universal health care, decent wages. These are things that you can thank Labor governments for. And while we're talking about Gough Whitlam, I just came from a forum where we celebrated 50 years since Gough Whitlam protected the Great Barrier Reef. But those opposites say he left Australia an economic basket case. Well, where would we be without the vision of Labor governments? A place I don't want to see. Thanks.
I thank the member for Canberra and I give the call to the member for Bean.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I'm also pleased to be speaking in favour of this bill and support any move to keep the national broadband network in public ownership. Now, Deputy Speaker, last night when I thought I might be speaking on this bill, I listened to the member for Fadden liken this debate to a Seinfeld episode. Well, Deputy Speaker, the truth, of course, is that the previous government did want to sell off the NBN and that those opposite have form when they eye off critical public infrastructure. And the truth, of course, Deputy Speaker, is that the whole Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government's approach to broadband was like a decade-long episode of Utopia or The Thick of It. But it's Australians who've paid the price for their negligence over that last 10 years. And Deputy Speaker, as a government, we are determined not to make the same mistakes as former coalition governments who have mismanaged communications policy in Australia for decades. And it comes from that beginning place of not actually really caring, thinking that these debates are about nothing when they are actually critical to the Australia not just of the now but of the decades to come. And Deputy Speaker, as much as they protest and try to airbrush history, the Liberals have shown a pathological desire to sell off critical assets. We know that the former coalition government had taken the initial legislative steps to prepare their NBN for sale, including declaring the network built and fully operational in 2020. Deputy Speaker, I wholeheartedly support this bill and the goal of providing a solid foundation for communication policy in this nation long into the future. When John Howard was swept from office in 2007, he left Australia a broadband backwater. For those that remember, the privatisation of Telstra was a terrible policy outcome driven by ideological zealotries. Crucially, the sale also deprived the government of strategic levers to drive the investment necessary for Australians to fully access reliable, high-speed broadband and the productivity and digital inclusion benefits that delivers. But of course, that was a government that had no understanding that this wasn't just to be an entertainment vehicle. This is a vehicle that was to transform workplaces, the way we deliver services. It's understandable that when governments lack vision, they don't understand why you need to invest in their future. So, of course, Labor's decision in 2008 to deploy a government-owned national broadband network rightly took a long-term view of the needs of Australian consumers and taxpayers in a changing world. The NBN was built by Australians for Australians. It belongs to all Australians and it belongs in public hands. Deputy Speaker, the NBN is an essential piece of national utility infrastructure, helping people connect regardless of where they lived or worked, not caring for what postcode they might be under, what region or state of the country that they live in. This was initiated by Labor with a positive vision for the future, delivering equity in access and opportunity, combined with sound long-term economics. It meant Australians would enjoy a world-class connectivity powering the digital economy for decades to come. So what happened next, Deputy Speaker? But enter the neoclassical wrecking ball of the Liberals, who attacked public ownership and any policy idea associated with it. Just as they sold out Australia on the privatisation of Telstra, the Coalition sold out Australia again. They abandoned fibre and instead deployed an almost absurd copper alternative for $29 billion. And Deputy Speaker, by May 2022, when the Albanese government was elected, the Coalition's second-rate NBN was $28 billion over budget, nearly double the cost, 4 years behind schedule, and then, of course, backflipping to fibre. And, Deputy Speaker, as I said before, the former Coalition government had taken the initial legislative steps to prepare their NBN for sale. This was their game plan. They also supported an NBN submission to increase wholesale prices on their products by CPI plus 3% to bolster their income streams in preparation for this sale. It was Telstra all over again. Fortunately, this was rejected by Labor and the ACCC. And, Deputy Speaker, for those members that genuinely seek to represent regional Australia, well, they should be cognisant that in government, consultation on regional telecommunication services there has been strong and clear feedback from communities in rural and regional communities that the national broadband network should stay in government ownership. And, Deputy Speaker, we've had quite a number of speakers who've gotten up and, whilst it's connected, have talked about challenges around mobile coverage, about dealing with black spots, and there are challenges across the country. You know, there are significant parts of my electorate that we're still working through those issues. But it beggars belief that the same people who effectively are making these arguments don't support the NBN remaining in public hands. Deputy Speaker, keeping the NBN in public ownership is essential to continue to provide modern, accessible and affordable communication services in Australia. The Albanese government understands this, and it's delivering its vision for a world-class, high-speed broadband network. Over $3 billion in NBN fibre and fixed wireless upgrades are being delivered on time and on budget. More than 70,000 kilometres of new fibre has been rolled out, and over 2,300 fixed wireless towers have been upgraded. And whilst today's debate about this bill, Deputy Speaker, is about our vision and securing the long-term policy settings of the nation, I would like to flag that I will continue to work with the NBN to better outcomes for households and businesses in my electorate of Bean. Much has been achieved, but there is still more to do, and I will not rest until we get the results that Bean deserves. And it's good to see that suburbs like Gordon, Banks and Conda, in the southernmost parts of the electorate of Bean, are amongst the suburbs that can now access these higher upgrades that are happening right around the country. And Deputy Speaker, the rollout of the NBN has correlated with downward pressure on the cost of communications in Australia, with an overall 9% decrease in communications prices from 2017 to 2024 compared to a 22% CPI growth over that time. So it's only by keeping the NBN in public ownership that that vision can continue to be delivered. And only the Labor government has committed to this vision. But, Deputy Speaker, it's not just the government which supports this policy. Consumers support it, and not just the regional consumers that I just talked about before. The Australian Communications Consumer Action Network CEO, Carol Bennett, is on the record as supporting it. Workers support it. Shane Murphy, the Communication Workers Union National President, has publicly backed this move. These are the workers who work with this infrastructure every day. The industry representatives support it. For example, Optus interim CEO Michael Venter has said his company supports this initiative. Deputy Speaker, the Albanese government's position on the NBN is clear. In 2021, we made an election commitment to retain the NBN in public ownership, to keep broadband affordable and to complete building a world-class fibre network. In 2022, we formalised this commitment in a new Statement of Expectations for the NBN, and we have introduced legislation now to enshrine this position in law. Deputy Speaker, Labor understands the NBN is not just something that earns a rate of return. It's a critical piece of social and economic infrastructure. And under Labor, the NBN will be affordable, it will be reliable, it will be fast, and it will be safe in public hands. I support this bill and the important goals behind it that will be of great benefit to the nation and the electorate of Bean, which I represent. So, Deputy Speaker, to make this clear again, on this side of the House, we strongly believe that the NBN needs to stay in full government ownership to support the ongoing upgrade of the network and ensure ongoing regulatory oversight of NBN wholesale pricing, keeping broadband affordable for Australians. We know what happens when you privatise assets like this. As I said, the government made this commitment clear in the updated Statement of Expectations issued to the NBN Co in 2022. Government ownership is essential to deliver the strategy for a more connected Australia, no matter what postcode you live in, including rolling out more fibre in the fixed line network, planning for the transition to next generation satellites, which of course, are going to be critical for parts of my electorate like Norfolk Island, and modernising universal service obligations. The NBN is crucial national infrastructure with cybersecurity and national security imperatives requiring strong government oversight. This is best delivered through certain ongoing government ownership. Any future sale of the NBN would likely involve foreign ownership, raising potentially serious national sovereignty and security risks. And as I said, I've mentioned before, Deputy Speaker, the former coalition government had taken the initial legislative steps to prepare the NBN for sale, including declaring the network built and fully operational in 2020, one of the great works of fiction of our times. So when the member for Fadden talked about this debate being a Seinfeld episode, a debate about nothing, it's not true. We know what their intent is. We know what would occur if they had the capacity to have control over the fate of the NBN again. Deputy Speaker, the sale of Telstra under the Howard government was a prime example of the coalition making promises on prices and services for telecommunications that were never delivered. And the sale of Telstra also deprived the government of leverage to roll out fibre broadband in Australia, necessitating the Rudd government's establishment of the NBN in 2008. Keeping the NBN in public ownership is essential to continue to provide modern, accessible and affordable communication services for all Australians. This is a message that I get time and time again from constituents across the electorate of Bean, whether it be in the Deep South, in the suburbs of Conder and Banks, whether it be in the Molonglo Valley, the new suburbs of out near Stromlo, or whether it be on Norfolk Island. My constituents are clear, and in accord with their wishes, I support this bill. I support the important goals behind it that will be of great benefit to the nation. I'm so proud to be a member of government with a Minister for Communications as strong and as effective as the Minister we have, who's delivering right across our country, but also delivering for all the constituents of the electorate of Bean.
Thank the member for Bean. The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Macon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I speak in support of this legislation, the National Broadband Network Companies Amendment Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024. And I appreciate the lateness of the hour, so I'll keep my remarks relatively brief because all of my colleagues have effectively made the points that I would otherwise make. And I commend the member for Bean who has just spoken, who outlined much of the history in respect to the NBN and put forward again the very strong case as to why it should remain in public hands. But let me just make a few observations more broadly about government assets or public assets and the privatisation of them. Firstly, with respect to the NBN, I can recall from day one when it was mooted as an important piece of national infrastructure that needed to be rolled out, the opposition at the time never had their heart in it from day one. They were opposed to it from day one, and quite frankly, when they came into government, made that absolutely clear by rolling out a second-rate NBN using the copper wires, etc., that we've spoken about time and time again. They did that, I think, for two reasons, and it's not just because they wanted to save money, but that firstly they wanted to get it finished off as quickly as possible so that they could then sell it off and get some money back into the coffers. But secondly, I genuinely believe that many members of the opposition really did not understand the significance of what the NBN would do to the future of our country and future generations. It is not just another piece of government property. It's actually an essential national asset, just like our highways are that connect people from one city to another. The NBN did even more than that because it became actually crucial to the way we operate society today. And as I get around the community, one of the things that comes back to me time and time again, particularly in the midst of cost of living debates, is why can't the government put a cap on these prices, and why can't the government control this other price? And in fact, why was those assets, or why were those assets ever sold off in the first place? Because they are so important to everyday living. Indeed, there is a growing sentiment that I'm detecting out there in the community that essential services should always be owned by the government and remain as government assets. In fact, years ago, there was some survey done, and I'm talking probably 20, 30 years ago, where we went through a period, not only here in Australia, but across the world, where public assets were being sold off by governments to private entities. That proved in the end to not have been a very smart decision, again, across the world, and there was a trend coming back, particularly in the Western countries, to buy back those assets. And I'm sensing the same mood right now. The reality is that the sale of public assets in the past may have provided some instant cash for the government of the day, and I hold both governments of both persuasions to account with respect to that. I'm not pointing the finger at anyone in particular. I'm talking about past governments. But in the long term, the public has paid dearly for them, because ultimately the price of the services provided by those public assets has gone through the roof. And secondly, in very few cases have they been properly maintained. And in reality, when they are not properly maintained, it always comes back to the taxpayer or the government of the day to pick up the costs of that unfunded infrastructure that ultimately builds up over time. Mr. Speaker, the argument that the private sector can provide services at lower costs than the public-owned entities is also a fallacy. It never truly eventuates, and quite frankly, if there is a problem with the government in terms of managing a particular entity, the answer is not to sell the entity off, but rather to look at what the problem is and get management to perhaps change its direction or whatever the case is. And what we have seen, and I'll use 2 or 3 examples, is that over the years, those assets that were sold off ultimately ended up charging prices that were unrealistic. The first example I want to use is the Commonwealth Bank. Commonwealth Bank was sold in 1996, I think the last part of the sale went through, for about the same amount of money that the Commonwealth Bank now makes in profit each and every year. But even worse than that, the other 3 big banks are equally making similar massive profits. Last year, the 4 major banks together made just under $30 billion of profit. The benefit of having a Commonwealth Bank at the time wasn't just because of the services it was providing, but it acted as a regulator for the other banks in terms of the interest rates and the fees that were being charged. And it set a standard that the other banks had to compete with, and in order to do so, they had to maintain the same level of charges and fees that the Commonwealth Bank did, and so everybody benefited, and that's why the massive profits were also not made. But the other matter, excuse me, with respect to the sell-off of those assets, is that where they are sold off, more often than not, it is foreign investors who come in and buy them. Many of our energy suppliers today are foreign owners. And so even if there is a profit to be made, the profit is not then spent back here in Australia. It is usually shipped off to an overseas country where it is used to benefit that country and the owner of those assets. So it is not even like we're selling them off and ensuring that profits made are then re-spent back in our own country. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that the same applies to Telstra. Telstra made $1.8 billion in profit last year. And again, yes, if it was government-owned, perhaps the profit would have been lower, but the fees and charges would have also been lower. And so, again, in the midst of a cost-of-living crisis, people would have been able to cope a lot better. Importantly, it would also enable the government of the day to ensure that the fees being charged were affordable by the broader public. Whereas now, whenever someone says, you know, energy prices are too high or Telstra prices are too high or whatever other private asset is charging, the response is, well, that's the free market in operation and governments really can't do very much about it. Mr Speaker, I've listened to some of the debate from members opposite and quite frankly, I do not understand what their problem is with the government retaining ownership of the NBN. Because it is such a crucial piece of infrastructure, it is important, and it is a monopoly service. It is important that, firstly, it's a reliable piece of infrastructure that the Australian people can have confidence in. It must be secure, because if it's not, it can totally disrupt the whole operations of this country. It must be affordable because everybody needs it. And so, again, if it's no longer a luxury or a commodity that people can choose to have or not to have. The reality is that you cannot operate today without it. So it must be affordable. And quite frankly, it must be secure. And the only way we can guarantee its security, or at least the only way we can best guarantee that its security, is if it remains in government hands, where the government can have oversight over exactly what's happening to it, who's got access to it, and what needs to be done to ensure all of that security continues. Mr Speaker, I'll finish on this. The Minister is sitting at the table, and I thank the Minister for this legislation, because quite frankly, even from day one, when the sale of it was talked about once it was complete, that the sale might happen, it was something that did not sit comfortably with me. When the Albanese government made the decision that the NBN would remain in public hands, I thought that is a decision that makes a lot of sense, provides confidence and security to the Australian people, and one that I would have thought the Australian people would get behind, including members of the opposition. It seems that is not the case, but can I say this is a decision that will be supported by the Australian people very broadly. This is a decision that I believe that they would be calling for, and quite frankly, the last thing they would want to see is such an important piece of infrastructure sold off to a private investor and possibly a foreign owner. With those comments, once again, I speak in support of this legislation.
The question is the bill be now read a second time. I give the call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The National Broadband Network Companies Amendment, Commitment to Public Ownership Bill 2024, reaffirms the government's commitment to ongoing public ownership of the National Broadband Network and to remove existing conditions that create a pathway to privatisation of this vital national infrastructure. The bill commits to keeping the NBN wholly owned by the Australian people, including a new Section 43A to make clear Parliament's intention that NBN Co would remain wholly owned by the Commonwealth. The bill removes current conditions that, once satisfied, would enable a future government to privatise the company. The Albanese government's position on the NBN has been clear for more than 3 years. We took a commitment to keep the NBN in public ownership to the last election, to keep broadband affordable in Australia, and to complete building a world-class fibre network. In 2022, we formalised this commitment in a statement of expectations for the NBN, and through this bill we are enshrining this commitment in law. The government's position has broad support in the community, across consumer groups, regional representatives and the telco sector. The Shadow Minister admitted in his speech on this bill that the opposition has been on notice since at least 2021 that the government was committed to keeping the NBN in public ownership, so they have had at least 3 years to come up with a position. Mr Speaker, I'm happy to stand corrected, but we heard over 20,000 words spoken by the opposition on this bill, but not the 7 words that Australians want to hear. We support keeping NBN in public ownership. The member for Bradfield, the person who declared that the NBN was built and fully operational in 2020, the first step in a sale process, finally admitted what we suspected all along. The opposition is not supporting this bill because they don't support keeping the NBN in public ownership. only a Labor government will keep the NBN owned by the Australian people to continue to deliver affordable, accessible, world-class broadband for Australia. I thank all members for their participation in the debate on this legislation.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. I'll put the question. Those in unit say aye. Against no. I think the ayes have it. Noes have it. Division required. In accordance with Standing Order 133, the division is deferred until the first opportunity the next sitting day. The debate on this item is therefore adjourned until that time. The House stands adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow.